Well, good Wednesday evening, everyone. It is February the 3rd. January's already in the books, and here we are starting a new month, and I'm glad that you are starting this new month by tuning in and joining us for Bible study as we continue to take a look at the book of Numbers. Hope you've got your Bibles with you. Open them if you do to Numbers chapter 8. We'll pick up where we left off last week. Hope you've been having a good week. I've been having a great week. What's made this week so great is we have officially now gotten our third staff member here at Concord Road. Cody Peary and his wife Ashley and their sweet little girl Hattie have moved up and have joined us now. Cody's first worship with us will be this coming Sunday. I think he's going to be a great addition to our church family and our ministry team. I'm so looking forward to getting to know Cody and Ashley better. I know a lot of you are as well. As I said Sunday, keep your eyes peeled for the email in which we're going to have a special kind of meet and greet to welcome them. And of course, it's going to be special because it's done during this time. And so we wanted to do it in such a way where we could respect issues like distancing and things like that. But it's so important to get them connected with the church family as quickly as possible. It's so tough, as I said Sunday, in times like this where our church activities, we just aren't able to have a lot of in-person activities. And with that and with distancing, it's just hard. Transitions are tough enough, like I said Sunday. And so we want to really try to welcome them and let them know that we are so glad that they're here and begin to develop that relationship. Okay, let's take a look at the book of Numbers. As I said, Numbers chapter 8 is where we're at. Last week, if you joined us, and I know that most of you did, we took a look at the first 4 verses of chapter 8. We said there's a couple of issues, a couple of topics that chapter 8 deals with. One is the setting up of the lampstand, and the other one is the dedicating of the Levites. We never got any further than the setting up of the lampstands. That's the first 4 verses. Because there was a principle expressed here that I said we just have to spend a little bit of time on. Anytime we come to it, it's really imperative to remind ourselves of some of these basic, fundamental points of serving God. And one of them is this at the end of verse 4, that everything that was done in terms of setting up the lampstand and all the work on the temple was according to the pattern which the Lord had showed Moses. And Aaron did exactly what Moses told him because what Moses told him was what God had said. We talked about that principle. And if you haven't had an opportunity to spend a little bit of time in that Bible class, if you weren't here with us last week, go back into the archives or just, there on the YouTube channel and be sure you pick that one up. Okay. Well, let's start off at verse 5 now as we take a look at the Levites. We're just going to kind of summarize this section as we get into chapter 9. But what we'll find here beginning in verse 5 of chapter 8 is these verses are essentially describing the Levites as an offering that was brought to the Lord by Israel at the Lord's command. And so we'll just read a couple of verses here. Look at verse 5. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the Levites from among the sons of Israel and cleanse them. Thus you shall do to them for their cleansing. Sprinkle purifying water on them, and let them use a razor over their whole body, and wash their clothes, and they will be clean." Okay, so Moses is instructed by God here to separate the Levites from the rest of the community, the rest of Israel. They are in preparation for the work that they have to do in terms of the temple work, or the tabernacle work rather. They have to be ceremonially clean, and so God is instructing Moses on how to cleanse them. After this takes place, after their cleansing, they are officially ready for their service to the tabernacle. Take a look at verse 14 real quickly. "Thus you shall separate the Levites from among the sons of Israel, and the Levites shall be mine." By means of this cleansing ceremony, once they've gone through this cleansing ceremony, they were set apart from the rest of the Israelites. They are now God's possession. They're a special possession of God. And they're ready to begin their work. As we said, look at verse 15. "Then after that, the Levites may go in to serve the tent of meeting, but you shall cleanse them and present them as a wave offering. So they've completed the purification ritual. They're ready to begin their work. Their purpose is really twofold. You get to see that down in verse 19. I have given the Israelites as a gift to Aaron and to his sons from among the sons of Israel to perform the service of the sons of Israel at the tent of meeting. That is kind of the first part of their twofold service. They are to perform the service of the sons of Israel at the tent of meeting. In other words, they're to do the work at the tent of meeting on behalf of the children of Israel. And the second is follows up there in verse 19, and to make atonement on behalf of the sons of Israel so that there will be no plague among the sons of Israel by their coming near to the sanctuary. And they are to provide atonement for the sons of Israel, not only to do work at the temple on behalf of the Israelites, but they are to make atonement for the Israelites so that no plague will break out among them as they get too close to the sanctuary. Remember, that's the presence of God. God's presence is going to be dwelling there in the tabernacle. And because of the holiness of God, we talked about this early in our lessons about the significance of that. The Levites are to camp around the tabernacle. They're always to be this buffer between the tabernacle and the people, and that was to emphasize the holiness of God. And so that is part of the work there that they are to perform. Take a look at verse 23. I said we're going to go through the rest of the chapter quickly, and we are. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, this is what applies to the Levites from 25 years old and upward. They shall enter to perform the service in the work of the tent of meeting. But at the age of 50 years, they shall retire from service in the work and not work anymore. So here we have, there is a 25-year work life, and they have mandatory retirement. I was talking to someone Sunday before church started, someone who kind of has been regularly visiting us during COVID, and he was telling me about what he did. He flew 747s for years and years, and as we were talking about that, did you fly freight? Did you fly commercial? He flew freight, and all over the world. And he said, of course, I had to retire at 65. It was a mandatory retirement. Some of you are in jobs that have a mandatory retirement like that at a particular age. Well, the Levites had a mandatory retirement, and that mandatory retirement was at 50. Why? We just simply don't know. God doesn't tell us. Maybe the work was particularly hard and, required just the strength of younger backs and quicker reflexes. Maybe it had something to do with just the nature of the work. But whatever it is, there was a mandatory retirement age. And a lot of times people ask about the whole principle of retirement. Is there something that is God intended for us to work? Is retirement somehow a violation of the principle of work? And the answer is no. Right here you can see it. This approves of the principle of retirement. Now, not retirement from serving God. That's really important to understand, that you might retire from flying, or you might retire from performing surgery, or you might retire from whatever, fill in the blank, but you never retire from serving God. But yeah, the principle of retirement, there is absolutely nothing wrong with the principle of retirement. Okay, so that's chapter 8. Let's get into chapter 9 now. Like chapter 8, chapter 9 deals with really two subjects. Its focus is on two subjects. One is the observance of the Passover, and the second subject, that's from verses 1 through 14. And the second topic that it deals with, subject that it deals with, begins in verse 15, and that is the cloud over the tabernacle that is going to guide the Israelites. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Let's talk a little bit about the Passover first of all. Now, I've said this a few times, but let me remind you again. The events that are happening here in chapter 9, they are actually preceding the senses of chapter 1. So chronologically, chapter 9 comes first. Keep in mind that the children of Israel at this time, they have been at Sinai for almost a year now after leaving Egyptian captivity. That means it's time to observe the Passover again before they head out for the Promised Land. And so, take a look. Let's read the first few verses here. Thus the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Now, let the sons of Israel observe the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month, at twilight, you shall observe it at its appointed time. You shall observe it according to all the statutes and according to all of the ordinances. So it's Passover time. They're to do this in the manner that was carefully prescribed by God. We will see their response in verse 4 and 5. So Moses told the sons of Israel to observe the Passover. And they observed the Passover in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses, so the sons of Israel did. Notice here the stress that's placed on the obedience of the Israelites at this point. Right now, they are doing exactly what God tells them to do. That is going to be a striking contrast to their later behavior. But right now, they are all in terms of obedience. And so they're going to do exactly what God tells them to do. Now, as they're about to carry out the Passover and observe the Passover, there is one group that can't observe it because they are ceremonially unclean. Take a look at that, verse 6. But there were some men who were unclean because of the dead person, so they could not observe the Passover on that day. Remember, we talked about ritual purity back in chapter 5 and 6. We said these first 9 chapters of the book of Numbers are all about 3 things. The first 4 chapters are all about the organization of the people of Israel, the community. Chapters 5 and 6 are all about the purity of the people of Israel. And then chapters 7 through 9 is all about the worship of the community. Well, this group here, some were impure. They were ceremonially unclean, and so they couldn't participate. And they understood that. But they wanted to participate. They wanted to eat the Passover. They wanted to make a sacrifice to God. And so they came to Moses. Let's just, again, go back to verse 6 here. And let's read a couple of verses. But there were some men who were unclean because of the dead person, so that they could not observe the Passover on that day. So because of their contact with the deceased, that rendered them ceremonially unclean. So they came before Moses and Aaron on that day, and those men said to him, Though we are unclean because of the dead person, why are we restrained from presenting the offering of the Lord at its appointed time among the sons of Israel? Moses therefore said to them, Wait, and I will listen to what the Lord will command concerning you. Okay, notice a couple of things here. As you're reading about this, there's several traits about this whole incident in verses 6, 7, and 8 that are real commendable, both on the men's part who can't participate because they're ritually unclean, and on Moses' part. The first thing is that they are concerned about the law's requirement. They know that they are unclean. They know what God has said about being unclean and the consequences of being unclean. So they understand that, and they respect that. The second thing, though, that's commendable is that they want to participate in the Passover, though. They want to present an offering to God. I love that. They didn't say, man, hey, we got out of it this year. We don't have to go through this whole process. They weren't interested in that. They weren't interested in the Passover. They wanted to be a part of this great event and everything that it commemorated. And they wanted to express their gratitude to God. They wanted to present an offering to God. They didn't want to get out of it. They wanted to do it. And then the next thing here in verse 8 that I find really commendable about this is that they sought guidance from Moses. Again, they understood that there was a proper source when getting spiritual guidance. And they knew that that proper source was Moses. And so they went to the proper source. And then, of course, Moses then, being God's representative, said, okay, let me see what God has to say. And so they understood and they respected the fact that they were unclean. They weren't trying to in any way get around the requirements of the law. They respected the law. They respected the lawgiver. But they wanted to present their offerings. They didn't want to get out of this. And to see if there was anything that they can do, they went to the proper source. They went to Moses as God's representative. And so Moses approaches the Lord and he says, I've got this situation and I need some guidance. And God responds to Moses in verse 9. Take a look at it. Then the Lord spoke to Moses saying, speak to the sons of Israel saying, if any one of you or your generations becomes unclean because of a dead person, or is on a distant journey, he may, however, observe the Passover to the Lord. In the 2nd month of the 14th day at twilight, they shall observe it. They shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall leave none of it until morning, nor break the bone of it according to all the statute and of the Passover. They shall observe it. Now look at verse 13. But the man who is clean and is not on a journey, and yet neglects to observe the Passover, that person shall then be... I think I said that wrong. Let's look at it. Go back again. But the man who is clean and is not on a journey, I think I said is on a journey. The man who is clean and is not on a journey and yet neglects the observance of the Passover, that person shall then be cut off from his people, for he did not present the offering to the Lord at its appointed time. That man will bear his sin. Okay, there's 2 reasons God says, okay. There are 2 reasons that a person, if they miss the Passover, they can observe it 1 month to the day later. They have to do everything exactly as appointed, exactly as prescribed, and the appointed day for them is 1 month later. The 2 groups that can do that are those who've had contact with a corpse and because of that contact have been, again, rendered ceremonially unclean. Or number 2, they've been away on a journey from the community and being away has prohibited their participation. They were out of town and they simply couldn't do it. They weren't there. They weren't present. And there was no way they could come together on that situation and do it. So those are the 2 exceptions that are given that God permitted them to follow up and observe the Passover. Okay, let's make a little application about the Passover, shall we? Then we'll get into the cloud over the tabernacle beginning in verse 15. But let's make a little application. I know that I don't have to tell you this, but I'm going to tell you it anyway. It's just Christianity 101. It's Theology 101. And that is the significance of the Passover. Now, I've said this many, many times, and I keep reminding you of what we have in the Bible, what the Bible is all about. The Bible begins, of course, with this perfect scenario. God has created His world. It is perfect. It is sin-free. It is pristine. He has created His image bearers, and He has placed them in that perfect world, and He has perfect fellowship with them. And that was the point. He was decided on His own initiative to create beings in His image that He could share His love with, that would glorify Him throughout the universe. And so that's how it was in the first 2 chapters. Of course, we know in chapter 3 what happened. Sin entered the picture. Sin infected the world. Sin infected His image bearers. And because of that sin, there was no longer fellowship, direct, intimate, face-to-face fellowship with God. God, being morally perfect, could not fellowship mankind in their fallen state. In fact, could not only not fellowship Him, but because God is morally perfect and infinitely just, He has to eternally destroy. He has to punish lawbreakers, sinners, because of their sin. That is the penalty for sin in eternity apart from His presence. Well, God is also not just a God who is infinitely just and holy, but He is perfect love. And because of that, God didn't want that to be the the permanent scenario. He wanted to redeem mankind, and he wanted to restore that relationship. We get to the end then of the Bible, and that's what we have. We have a restoration of that relationship. Man's sins are forgiven, and beginning in Revelation chapter 21, we see the new heaven and earth, and God comes down and makes his dwelling in verse 4 with man. He shall dwell among them. He will be their God, and they will be his people. And in the first 5 verses of Revelation chapter 22, John even uses images of Eden to describe that. So you have a restoration at the end of the Bible of everything that was lost in the fall. Now, everything from that beginning to the end, all is about God accomplishing that, restoring what was lost in the fall. And the way he's going to restore that is through a special servant. And that special servant is the second person of the Godhead. It's the only way that sin could be atoned for. And so what we have as we read the story from Genesis chapter 3 all the way up to Revelation chapter 21 and 22 is we have God accomplishing, conquering sin and restoring what was lost through Jesus Christ. And the whole sacrificial system that God instituted here at Mount Sinai was pointing to Jesus. And no sacrifice and no festival more clearly pointed to Jesus than the Passover. Let me remind you of a few things in a few minutes that we have left. We're going to have to go over to the New Testament for this now. Just hold your place, though, because I will bounce back once here in the book of Numbers, chapter 9, so you might want to put your mark there. Turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Now, of course, when God instituted the Passover to the children of Israel, they had no idea of its real significance. All they knew was that they were sinners, that God was infinitely holy, and sin needed to be atoned for or they would be destroyed. And so all they knew was they had to continue to make this sacrifice in order to appease God and turn away God's wrath. They had no idea that what God was doing in that was pointing forward to another atoning sacrifice that would be the one final atoning sacrifice that was necessary. The only atoning sacrifice that could really take away sin. See, the children of Israel really never understood that the Passover sacrifice couldn't really take away sin. That wouldn't be understood until later. But if you look in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, 1 Corinthians chapter 5, look down at about verse 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. Paul is saying this, as he is rebuking immorality. This is that chapter where at the beginning Paul is rebuking them because they are so tolerant of gross sexual immorality in their midst. And Paul is telling them to purge that. And so he says in verse 6, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Christ, our Passover, has also been sacrificed. Christ is our Passover. When these Israelites were doing what they were doing there at Mount Sinai 1 year after they left Egypt, they were pointing to Jesus Christ, God's ultimate plan for defeating sin. They had a Passover. We've got the ultimate Passover. Their Passover was something that foreshadowed the real Passover. Jesus Christ is our Passover. That's why, turn over to the Gospel of John. That's why John chapter 1, you'll see this statement in verse 29, as Jesus comes down to the Jordan River to take his place among the lost. And John, who is baptizing, looks up and he sees Jesus. Look at verse 29. The next day he saw Jesus coming to him and said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. This is the Lamb. This is the one who is taking away the sin of the world. And so what was going on there at Sinai was foreshadowing Jesus and the Christian era, the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan for redeeming humanity. Also keep in mind, not only are we told there in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7 that Jesus is the Passover, not only do we hear John say, look, this is the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world, but you remember what was going on in Jerusalem when Jesus was sacrificed. What festival? What major festival and feast was happening there? It was the Passover. Remember, Jesus told his disciples, find the room where I can celebrate the Passover with you. And it was during Passover that Jesus instituted the supper. That's not a coincidence. That's all part of God's plan because Jesus is the Passover lamb. And not only that, but take a look at John chapter 19. John chapter 19. This is significant. John chapter 19. Looking at verse 36. As Jesus is crucified here, John's account of the crucifixion, you get down to verse 36, and it says, "For these things came to pass to fulfill Scripture, not a bone of him shall be broken." Jesus' bones were not broken. That also connects him to the Passover. Now, I told you to hold your place there in Numbers chapter 9. We'll go back and see that. And so take a look at it in verse 12, where, again, this is Moses who, after the men who wanted to observe the Passover who couldn't, asked about an exception. And Moses said, let me check with God on that. And so this is part of that instruction there again. Look at verse 12. "They shall leave none of it in the morning, nor break a bone of it, according to all the statute of the Passover. They shall observe it." Now, that was important part of the Passover. Not a bone of it will be broken. Jesus, our Passover, that connection to the Passover is shown in that his bones were not broken. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1. Take a look now at 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1, look down at verse 18. Look at verse 17. "If you address as Father the one who impartially judges according to each one's work, conduct yourself in fear during that time of your stay on the earth, knowing that you were not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your futile ways of life inherited from your forefathers, but with precious blood, as of a lamb unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ." We are saved by the blood. Remember, that was what the Passover was all about. They were to kill the lamb and they were to take the blood and they were to put the blood on the doorposts and they would put the blood all around the door. And so as God came to unleash the ultimate plague on the Egyptians, he would see the blood. And when he saw the blood, he would pass over the houses of God's people. They were saved by the blood. In the same way, we are saved by the blood. When we contact the blood of Jesus Christ, at the moment that we're baptized into Christ, based on our penitent faith, it is that blood that saves us. It is that blood that preserves us. And so when we stand before the infinitely holy God in judgment, he sees us through the blood. The blood has been applied to us. And he will say, no punishment for you, no judgment for you. And so we are spared that, not because of our own goodness, not because of our own heroic deeds, but because of the blood. All of these connections. And so as we watch the Passover in its early days, emphasized there at Mount Sinai, we know what God is foreshadowing, that he's saying something bigger is coming, something better is coming, something that is really effective is coming. My plan is ultimately going to come to fruition through one final sacrifice, and that is going to be Jesus Christ. And also, like the Passover, the last thing that I'll point out is we have a meal to remember it. It's the Lord's Supper. That's why it was instituted during the Passover. Jesus took the bread and he took the cup and he ate the bread and he drank the cup and he told his people that they were to eat the bread and they were to drink the cup. And that's what we see as we look at the New Testament. That was the general pattern among God's people. They met together every first day of the week, Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, to eat that Passover. It's not to be neglected. We see the same thing emphasized in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. When you come together, Paul said, it's not to eat. He was saying it should be to eat the Lord's Supper, but you're not eating it. They had messed up the Lord's Supper so bad, but they should have been meeting together to eat the Lord's Supper. How often? Well, we learn in chapter 16 of that same book, 1 Corinthians, how often they were meeting, because there he says that upon the first day of every week, let each one of you lay by in store. That they were obviously coming together on the first day of the week, and so it was the perfect time to lay by in store and make a contribution to meet the legitimate needs of God's people. So we have a meal to remember our Passover by, and like the people of God, we should not neglect it. That's why Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25 would say, don't neglect the assembling of yourselves together. Do not neglect the assembling of yourselves together. We come together, and one of the primary reasons we come together every week is to eat the Passover. By the way, let me say this. I will say this as we kind of wrap things up here. I'm kind of reminded of what we just read in chapter 9. We come together on the first day of the week as God's people to eat the Passover, or eat our Passover meal, which is the Lord's Supper, to commemorate the work of Jesus Christ and how through His blood God passes over us in judgment. But I'm also reminded of the fact that some people aren't able to be with us. And they're like those men that came to Moses and said, we know we're not able to do this, but we want to observe this. Is there anything that we can do? There's people who just can't be with us for whatever reason. Some people have jobs. Some jobs are important 24/7. There's some people are healthcare workers, and some people are first responders and law enforcement and national defense, and as a result, 24/7 the job has to be manned, and so sometimes they're not able to be here, but they still want to observe it. What do we do? Well, that's one of the things that churches that I've always been associated with, and everywhere I've gone, they've recognized that, and so they've made the Lord's Supper available for people who can't be with the whole church. And maybe they can be there on Sunday evening. And so we always, this, on Sunday evening we give people an opportunity to partake the Lord's Supper who are not able to be there. And because it's important to them. They want to take that moment. They want to commune with God. Now I know the Lord's Supper is both a horizontal and a vertical thing, and that it's a communal meal, and should they take it? Those discussions have always been there. Should they take it? If they weren't able to be there, if they were, as we would say, providentially hindered, does God really, expect them to partake of it? And I say about that is I understand their desire to do it, because I know it's a horizontal thing, it's a communal meal, but it also is vertical. It's not just a horizontal meal. In eating the Lord's Supper, we also commune with God. We're reminded of the fact that we're in covenant with God. We're expressing our gratitude to God as we eat and as we drink for the wonderful gift that brings us into a relationship with Him. So I have always supported what we do here and what we've done at every congregation I've been with and every congregation that I know of in providing the Lord's Supper for those on Sunday evening for those who are unable to take it when we come together as a church on Sunday morning and take it. We're out of time. Thought we might get through all of chapter 9. We did not. Next week we will pick up with verse 15. We'll talk about that fiery cloud over the tabernacle. And then we'll get into some of the great narrative of Numbers as we move in to chapter 10. But again, I am so glad that you joined me tonight for Bible study. Thank you so much for your just consistency in tuning in. I just appreciate it. I just appreciate your heart for the Lord, your heart for His Word, your desire to continue to study. Even though we can't be together in person, we're hoping and we're praying that the plan of the elders will come to fruition in 1 month, and that this will be the last month, that it is online only, that we'll be able to pick up in person in March. Be praying for that. I'm praying for that. In the meantime, I hope to see you really soon this Lord's Day. Take care, and God bless.